The billionaire's laughter died in his throat as he pointed at the waitress and sneered, "Recite just 10 verses from memory." The upscale Dubai restaurant plunged into silence. Amina set down her tray. With quiet dignity, she began to speak, her voice clear, rhythmic, certain. Verse after verse poured forth, 47 in total, each syllable perfect. The smirk evaporated. By the time she finished, the man was on his feet, his eyes glistening, and what happened next would prove that true wealth doesn't wear a watch. Amina had spent years memorizing the Quran in a cramped apartment after 14-hour shifts, clinging to a promise made to her dying grandmother. That night, she was just a waitress to the wealthy patrons who never saw her, but her quiet devotion concealed a spiritual discipline that few could match. When the mockery came, it wasn't just a test of memory, it was a collision between arrogance and hidden grace. The question that lingered as the restaurant fell silent wasn't just how many verses she knew, but what had forged such unshakable faith in a woman the world overlooked. Here is the story of a promise that refused to die. Amina was born in a small farming village in southern Egypt, where the Nile's green ribbon gave way to endless desert. Her grandmother, Khald, was the heart of the household, a woman whose hands never stopped moving, kneading bread, grinding spices, or turning the pages of a worn leather mushaf. At night, when the heat finally loosened its grip, Khald would gather the children and recite. Her voice was old parchment and honey, each verse a lifeline to a world beyond their dusty alleys. Amina would sit at her feet, mouthing the words, feeling them settle in her chest like seeds. By the age of 9, Amina had memorized the final 10 chapters. Her grandmother saw the gift immediately, not just a sharp memory, but something deeper, a hunger for the words themselves. Khald took her aside one evening and made her promise, "Ya binti, carry the Quran in your heart. When I am gone, it will be your companion, your shield, your light in every dark room." Amina nodded, not fully understanding the weight of that covenant. She would understand soon enough. At 12, Amina lost both her parents in a bus accident on the desert highway. The grief hollowed her out. For months, she barely spoke. Khald, already frail, became her anchor, and the Quran became her refuge. She poured herself into memorization, spending hours in the mosque, her young voice weaving through the parched air. By 16, she had committed the entire holy book to memory, a hafizah, a guardian of the divine text. Her grandmother wept the day she completed it, her eyes shining with pride. "This is your true inheritance," she whispered. "Not land or gold, but what you hold within you." But survival in rural Egypt was a merciless arithmetic. Amina's uncles took over the family farm, and with her grandmother's health failing, there was little left for a young woman without a husband or a degree. When Khald finally passed, her final words were a repetition of that childhood promise. Amina stood beside the grave, reciting Surah Yasin, tears cutting tracks through the dust. She was 22 years old, alone, and holding a diploma in a language no one could see on a resume. The decision to move to Dubai came from desperation and hope in equal measure. An agency recruited workers for the hospitality sector, glittering hotels, polished restaurants, the gleaming machinery of Gulf hospitality. The pay, they said, could transform a family's fortunes. Amina had no family left to transform, but she had a promise to keep, and that promise demanded she survive. She boarded the plane with one suitcase, a small photo of her grandmother, and the entire Quran burned into her neural pathways. Dubai swallowed her like a gilded whale. The city was a fever dream of glass and steel, islands shaped like palm fronds, cars that cost more than entire villages. For the tourists and tycoons, it was paradise. For the army of invisible workers who polished every surface, it was a relentless grind. Amina landed a job at Al Nakhil Palace, a restaurant so exclusive that reservations required knowing someone who knew someone. The clientele included sheikhs, oil executives, European royalty, and the occasional Hollywood celebrity. The cheapest appetizer cost more than her monthly rent. Her days began at dawn with prayer and a quick shower in her cramped studio apartment in Deira, a neighborhood that felt worlds away from the city's shimmering core. The apartment was barely large enough for a bed and a stove, the walls thin enough to hear the neighbors' arguments. She would catch the bus at 6:30, arrive at the restaurant by 8, and spend the next 14 hours on her feet. Polishing silverware, folding napkins into elaborate fans, memorizing the night's menu in Arabic and English, carrying trays so heavy they left bruises on her shoulders. The other staff members knew Amina as quiet and diligent, the one who never complained, who volunteered for the latest shifts when others went home. What they didn't know was that each night, after she dragged herself through the door, after she soaked her swollen feet in cold water and ate a simple meal of bread and cheese, she would open her mushaf and recite. 2 hours every night. Not out of obligation, but because the words were the only thing that made the exhaustion bearable. The rhythm of the verses washed away the day's indignities, the dismissive glances from patrons, the condescending tones, the way wealth could curdle into cruelty without consequence. For 6 years, she kept this routine. No one knew she was a Hafiza. It never came up. In the social pecking order of Dubai, a waitress was a waitress, her inner life irrelevant to those she served. She stitched her grandmother's promise into every recitation, feeling the old woman's presence in the quiet hours between midnight and Fajr. Across the city, in a penthouse overlooking the marina, lived a man named Tariq al-Zahrani. He was 54 years old, the founder of a real estate empire that spanned 3 continents. His net worth hovered somewhere around $3.8 billion. He owned a private jet, a stable of thoroughbreds, and a yacht named Kama after his late mother. Tariq had built his fortune from nothing, a story he told often, recounting the days when he sold knockoff watches in Abha, Saudi Arabia. Now he moved through the world with the swagger of a man who believed his wealth was a verdict on his character, not his luck. Tariq had a complicated relationship with religion. He fasted during Ramadan, gave generously to charities that bore his name, and would never be caught publicly insulting Islam. But privately, among his inner circle, he expressed a cynical view of devotion. Too much piety, he believed, was a performance, a mask for the hypocritical and the weak. Real men made money, the poor clung to prayer because they had nothing else. He'd seen too many so-called devout businessmen cheat partners after Jummah prayer, too many preachers living in mansions off the gullible's donations. Over time, his skepticism had hardened into casual contempt. On the evening in question, Tariq was hosting a dinner for 6 associates at Al Nakhil Palace. The group included a Swedish tech investor, 2 Saudi cousins from rival construction firms, a French art dealer, and a British financial consultant. The conversation flowed from market projections to political scandals, lubricated by a $10,000 bottle of Chateau Margaux. And then, as the night deepened, the topic turned to religion. Tariq held court, his voice tinged with mockery. "Everyone here pretends to be so devout," he said, gesturing broadly, "but how many can actually back it up? We grew up hearing about Hafiz and Hafiza, people who memorize the entire Quran. I've met plenty who claim it. I've met very few who can prove it." His associates laughed, egging him on. The Saudi cousins nodded knowingly. The French dealer looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Amina was assigned to their table that night. She moved silently, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, her hijab neat, her eyes downcast. She had learned years ago that invisibility was safer. She heard every word, of course. The acoustics of the private dining room were unforgiving, but she said nothing until Tariq's gaze fell on her. He noticed her hijab first, then the quiet humility in her posture. To his jaded eyes, she was another symbol of performative faith, a woman who covered her hair but probably knew nothing of the text she supposedly revered. He leaned back in his chair, a smug grin spreading across his face, and gestured toward her with his wine glass. "You," he said, loud enough for the entire table to hear. "You wear the hijab, you must be religious. How much Quran do you really know? I bet you can't even recite 10 verses from memory." The table went quiet. The other servers froze. Amina felt the heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from something far more complicated. She thought of her grandmother, of the promise of 6 years of silent recitation in a cramped apartment. And then she set down her tray. She faced Tariq al-Zahrani, the billionaire who had just mocked her in front of his wealthy guests, and she did something that erased every preconception in that room. She began to recite, "Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim." The first words of Surah Al-Fatiha fell from her lips like cool water, clear and unhurried. The restaurant, already hushed, became a cathedral of silence. Tariq's smirk faltered. He had expected stuttering or silence. What he got was a melody that had been polished over 6 years of midnight practice. By the 10th verse, she had transitioned into Surah Al-Baqarah, the longest chapter, and her voice had found its power, not loud but resonant, every letter pronounced with the precision her grandmother had drilled into her as a child. The Swedish investor's jaw went slack. The French art dealer, who barely understood Arabic, was transfixed by the sheer musicality. And Tariq, who knew the words intimately from childhood, felt each syllable land like a verdict. She wasn't reading. Her eyes were half closed, fixed on nothing. The verses were emerging from memory, from the fortress she had built inside her heart, 47 verses. She stopped exactly at the end of a passage that speaks of faith, humility, and the fleeting nature of worldly wealth. Not a single error, not a single pause. The last word hung in the air like incense. And then she opened her eyes, looked directly at Tariq, and spoke for the first time since the challenge. My grandmother told me the Quran is not for performance, it is for the soul. Her tone was gentle, but it cut deeper than any rebuke. Tariq stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped back and nearly toppled. His face, which had been flushed with wine and arrogance, was now pale. The silence was absolute. Then he did something none of his associates had ever witnessed. He placed his hand on his heart, bowed his head slightly, and said, "I owe you an apology. I was arrogant and ignorant. Please forgive me." The words were strained, as if being pried from a place he rarely accessed. Amina nodded once, a small gesture that carried the weight of her grandmother's promise. She picked up her tray, resumed her duties, and the restaurant slowly returned to its hum of whispered conversation. But nothing was the same. Tariq's guests looked at him differently, and he looked at himself differently. Before leaving, he approached the manager and asked for an envelope. Inside, he placed the equivalent of $20,000 in local currency and a handwritten note on the restaurant stationery. "Thank you for reminding me that true wealth lies in faith and humility, not gold." He signed it with his personal phone number, something he had done perhaps 5 times in his entire career. That could have been the end. A beautiful moment of moral victory, shared among those present and forgotten by morning. But one of the Saudi cousins had been discreetly recording the entire thing on his phone, first to capture the mockery, then, stunned, to capture the recitation. By midnight, the video was on his private social media. By sunrise, it had jumped to public platforms. And by noon, Amina al-Masri, the Dubai waitress who silenced a billionaire with the Quran, had become a global phenomenon. The numbers were staggering: 12 million views in the first 24 hours, 27 million by day 3. The video was shared by imams, actors, politicians, and ordinary people across the Muslim world and beyond. News channels in Cairo, London, and Jakarta ran segments. The hashtag "The Waitress Who Knew" trended in 7 countries. Amina had wanted to be invisible, and now the entire planet was looking directly at her. Amina's first instinct was to hide. She called in sick to work, turned off her phone, and stayed in her tiny Daira apartment, curtains drawn. She prayed the noon prayer, then the afternoon prayer, then sat on her bed trembling. Her grandmother had taught her that the Quran was a private companion, not a public spectacle. She had recited only because she was challenged and could not let the mockery stand. Now her recitation was being dissected by strangers who debated her tajweed and questioned her motives. The restaurant offered her a promotion and a raise. They wanted her to recite during a special evening, a clear publicity grab. She refused. Her colleagues, who had barely spoken to her before, now treated her like a celebrity, asking for selfies. The attention felt like 1,000 hands pulling at her hijab. This was not the life she had built. It was the opposite of sanctuary. And then Tariq al-Zahrani called, not through an assistant, but directly, using the number he had left. He had been watching the coverage with a mixture of admiration and guilt. He was a man unaccustomed to shame, but the shame he now felt was relentless. He saw the harassment she was receiving, the paparazzi outside her building, the invasive questions. He recognized, perhaps for the first time, the cost of his arrogant challenge. He called to offer help, a public statement taking full responsibility, legal protection, a quiet villa away from the media frenzy. She listened politely, then said, "I do not need your money or your protection. I only needed you to respect the words of God. If you want to help me, learn them yourself." She hung up and the line went dead. But his heart, for the first time in decades, was fully alive. That refusal hit him harder than any business reversal. He sat alone in his penthouse, the video still playing on his screen, and he wept, not out of sadness, but out of a strange, unfamiliar sense of hope. What Amina didn't know was that her words had detonated a second bomb. Tariq, the billionaire who had mocked devotion, announced on his company's social media that he was taking a leave of absence to focus on spiritual study. He would begin memorizing the Quran himself, guided by a scholar from Al-Azhar. The internet erupted again. Commentators split. Some called it a genuine transformation, others decried it as a PR stunt. But for Amina, the news brought a new danger. Hardline voices in her own community, the same ones who had celebrated her recitation, now turned on her. They accused her of causing fitna, of attracting improper attention to a woman's voice in public, of turning the holy text into a viral challenge. Anonymous messages flooded in, some threatening, many vicious. Amina had withstood poverty, loss, and exhaustion, but this was a different kind of assault. The very faith that had sustained her was being weaponized against her. She needed to decide whether to retreat fully into anonymity or to defend the innocence of her act. And she had no guide, only her grandmother's voice echoing across the years. Meanwhile, Tariq, unaware of the severity of her ordeal, prepared to make his first public appearance since the recitation. He would deliver a televised address explaining his transformation and publicly thanking Amina. What he didn't know was that his speech would force a confrontation that neither of them were prepared for, and that the woman who had once saved him with 47 verses might need saving herself. The backlash did not come from strangers alone. It crept into the mosque where Amina had found refuge for 6 years, the modest mosque in Deira where the imam knew her by name. He had always praised her quiet devotion. Now he called her into his office, his expression troubled. A group of elders had petitioned him, he said, to bar her from reciting in the women's section. They argued that her voice, now viral, had become a source of fitna, temptation, and discord, because millions of men had heard her recitation online. The imam, a gentle man, looked pained. He told her he would not ban her, but he urged her to consider stepping back until the controversy passed. Amina walked out of his office, past the sisters she had prayed beside for years, and felt the cold shift in their eyes. Her sanctuary was gone. That same week, the restaurant manager called her in. The promotion she had refused was now a threat. They had received dozens of complaints, some from influential patrons, that the restaurant had become a political and religious lightning rod. Reservations had dropped. Wealthy families cancelled private events. The manager, who had always been kind, avoided her gaze as he explained that a leave of absence might be in everyone's best interest, unpaid, of course. Amina signed the paperwork without a word. As she left, she passed the private dining room where Tariq al-Zahrani had mocked her. The table was set for a party that would never come. She traced her fingers over the back of a chair and whispered a prayer for patience. But the worst arrived on a Friday afternoon when a package was delivered to her apartment. It was a simple envelope, no return address. Inside was a single photograph of her grandmother's grave in Egypt, the headstone defaced with black paint. A message beneath it read, "You have brought dishonor to the Quran. Silence yourself, or we will silence you." Amina collapsed onto her prayer rug, the photograph trembling in her hands. She had never felt so utterly alone. The promise she had carried across deserts and years now seemed like a curse, drawing hatred from the very community she had loved. Meanwhile, Tariq al-Zahrani prepared for his televised speech with the nervous energy of a man who had never been nervous before. His transformation had captivated the media, but it had also infuriated many. Business rivals whispered that he was having a breakdown. Some of his own family members distanced themselves, embarrassed by what they saw as a public display of weakness. But Tariq pressed on, meeting daily with a scholar from Al-Azhar, a man named Sheikh Ibrahim, who was gentle and uncompromising. The sheikh guided him through the early chapters of the Quran, and Tariq discovered with each session that the words he had mocked were dismantling him from the inside. He called it a demolition and a rebuilding, happening simultaneously. It was Sheikh Ibrahim who first showed him the photograph that had been sent to Amina. It had surfaced on an encrypted messaging group where extremists celebrated their intimidation campaign. The Sheikh, through his own networks, had obtained a copy and recognized the woman at the center of the storm. He contacted Tariq not as a billionaire, but as a fellow Muslim. "You started this. You must help her." Tariq stared at the defaced grave, and for the first time in his life, he felt the full weight of the destruction his arrogance could cause. He had not sent the threat, but his mockery had lit the match that others used to burn her world. He tried calling Amina. She did not answer. He called again, and finally, on the 10th attempt, a fragile voice picked up. He heard the exhaustion, the fear. He did not offer money this time or protection wrapped in condescension. He simply said, "I have seen what they sent you. I am coming to Deira right now." And he went not with bodyguards or a convoy of luxury cars, but in a simple taxi wearing a traditional thobe. He climbed the narrow stairs to her apartment, his 54-year-old knees protesting. When she opened the door, he saw that her eyes were red, her hands still gripping the prayer beads her grandmother had given her. He sat on her floor beside her prayer rug and said nothing for a long time. Then he recited the only chapter he had memorized so far, Surah Al-Fatiha. His pronunciation was clumsy, his voice nothing like a polished recitation, but every word trembled with sincerity. Amina wept. He told her of his speech, an address scheduled for 3 days later to be broadcast across the region. He wanted to publicly thank her, to take responsibility, but more than that, he wanted to stand beside her. He asked her to join him on that stage, to recite a few verses, to show the world that the Quran could not be silenced by hatred. She shook her head. Public appearances terrified her. The spotlight felt like a furnace, but he persisted, not with the arguments of a businessman, but with the urgency of a man who had seen the abyss. "They want you to hide," he said. "They want you to disappear. If you do, they win. But if you stand, not for fame, not for money, but for the promise you made to your grandmother, then the light that came from her grave will outshine the darkness that tried to deface it." Amina looked at the photograph of her grandmother she kept on her nightstand, the one beside the mushaf. She remembered the old woman's voice, the smell of herbs and earth, the promise she had made as a child. "Carry the Quran in your heart," her grandmother had said, "not hide it, carry it." Perhaps carrying it meant walking into the very fire that threatened to consume her. She looked back at Tariq. "I will stand with you," she said, "but not as your cause, not as your symbol, as myself, as Amina, the waitress who loved her grandmother." Tariq nodded, and the deal was sealed. News of the joint appearance leaked within hours. The reaction was explosive. Conservative clerics in Saudi Arabia and Egypt issued statements denouncing a woman reciting in such a public mixed-gender forum. A prominent sheikh called it a circus that demeans the Book of Allah. Others praised it as a bold stand against extremism. The controversy ensured that by the time the broadcast was scheduled, an estimated 50 million people across the Arab world would be watching. The pressure on Amina was unimaginable. Camera crews lined the streets outside her building. She could not leave without a scarf over her face, and even then the flashes pursued her. She was a waitress who had wanted to be invisible, and now the whole world demanded a piece of her soul. In the final hours before the speech, something changed. Sheikh Ibrahim, who had been counseling Tariq, asked to meet Amina privately. He was an old man, his beard white, his eyes carrying the weight of decades of study. He sat with her in Tariq's penthouse, away from the chaos, and he told her something she had never heard before. Her grandmother, Khaled, had once been known in the villages of southern Egypt as a woman of profound spiritual wisdom. She had taught not only her family, but had once traveled to Al-Azhar, where a young student named Ibrahim had heard her recite and had been so moved that he had devoted his life to the Quran. That student was him. Sheikh Ibrahim had been searching for her grandmother for years, only to discover, in this storm of controversy, that the woman who had once inspired him had a granddaughter carrying her legacy. The circle was closing. Amina stared at him, unable to speak. Her grandmother, the humble healer of a dusty village, had touched a future scholar without ever knowing it. And now, through Amina, her light was reaching millions. That revelation broke something open in Amina. She was not an accident. She was not a viral sensation. She was the continuation of a chain that stretched back through generations, a chain of women who whispered the Quran into their children's hearts. She stood a little taller. The fear did not vanish, but it now had a companion, a fierce, quiet certainty. The night of the broadcast arrived. A stage had been erected in a cultural center overlooking the Dubai skyline, with the Burj Khalifa glowing in the distance. The audience included dignitaries, journalists, religious scholars, and ordinary people who had won a lottery to attend. Tariq walked onto the stage first, his heart pounding. He approached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and began his speech. He spoke of his arrogance, his mockery, and the moment a waitress had unmade him with 47 verses. He called it the most expensive and most precious lesson of his life. And then he paused, turned toward the side of the stage and said, "I am not the one you should be watching tonight. She is." Amina walked out, her hijab simple, her steps steady. She stood at the center of the stage, looked out at the sea of faces, and realized that she was no longer invisible. She took a breath, and just before she began to recite, the lights from the Burj Khalifa dimmed and then blazed with a single projected verse chosen to honor her grandmother. "Indeed, it is we who sent down the Quran, and indeed we will be its guardian." The cameras zoomed in. The world watched. And Amina, the waitress who had kept a promise across an ocean of grief, opened her mouth to let the words of God pour forth once more. She did not begin with Al-Fatiha this time. She began with Surah Ad-Duha, the chapter of the morning brightness, the verses that descended upon the Prophet when he feared his Lord had forsaken him. Her grandmother had loved this surah and had whispered it to Amina on nights when the world felt like a closing door. Now every syllable rang across the cultural center, carried by microphones and satellites into 50 million homes. The audience forgot to breathe. Tariq stood at the side of the stage, tears streaming freely down his face, his lips moving in silent accompaniment. Sheikh Ibrahim, seated in the front row, closed his eyes and saw the young village woman who had once inspired him, present in the voice of her granddaughter. The extremist who had sent that photograph, watching from a dim room in another country, felt something crack inside his chest. Not repentance, not yet, but a splinter of doubt that would later bloom into a letter of apology Amina would receive months later, unsigned but unmistakable. When she finished, the silence was the loudest sound she had ever heard. Then the entire hall rose to its feet, not in applause, but in a spontaneous recitation of Takbir, Allahu Akbar, rippling from the front rows to the back, a wave of exaltation that could not be choreographed or scripted. The Burj Khalifa, still glowing with the verse of protection, seemed to bow toward the stage. That night changed the trajectory of the conversation around her. The hardline clerics who had condemned her appearance fell silent. To attack her now would be to attack the experience of millions who had been moved to prayer and tears. The mosque in Deira issued a quiet retraction of its earlier caution, and the imam personally visited her apartment to ask forgiveness, which she gave without hesitation. The restaurant, facing a wave of public support for Amina, reversed course and established a scholarship fund in her name for employees seeking religious education. Amina never returned to wait tables, not because she was too proud, but because her purpose had shifted irrevocably. Tariq al-Zahrani kept his word. He stepped back from daily operations of his company, delegating to a trusted board, and devoted himself to memorization. It took him 3 years to become a hafiz, slow, painstaking years in which he sat at the feet of Sheikh Ibrahim, a gray-haired student among children, humbled by the beauty of the text he had once dismissed. At his completion ceremony, he invited Amina to be the one to test his recitation, and as he recited the final verses of Surah An-Nas without a single error, she smiled and said, "Now you understand what wealth truly means." He would later fund the construction of 15 Quranic schools across Yemen, Somalia, and Sudan, naming each one Khaled Academy after Amina's grandmother. He never sought publicity for it. The press discovered it only when a journalist pieced together the naming pattern years later, a final, beautiful secret. But the most surprising consequence was the one no one saw coming. 9 months after the broadcast, Amina received a letter from the Egyptian government. The photograph of her grandmother's defaced grave had been widely circulated, and the image had sparked a public outcry. Anonymous donors, some wealthy, some ordinary, had contributed to a fund for the restoration and preservation of rural Quranic teachers' resting places. Her grandmother's grave was restored with a marble headstone inscribed with the words of Surah Al-Fatiha, and the surrounding cemetery became a protected heritage site. Amina traveled to the village for the first time since her grandmother's death. She stood before the new grave, surrounded by the same fields and dusty roads that had shaped her, and she recited the Quran from beginning to end over the course of 3 days, completing the khatam her grandmother had always prayed she would one day perform at her resting place. She left a small photo of herself at the grave, with a note that said, "I kept my promise." Amina's own path led her not into permanent celebrity, but into a quieter, more profound mission. She founded the Khaled Foundation, a small organization that identified girls in rural Egypt with a gift for memorization and provided them with scholarships, mentorship, and a path to become teachers themselves. The foundation's first cohort of 12 girls graduated 3 years later, and among them was a child from her own village, a girl named Nura who had the same hunger Amina had carried at 9 years old. Nura would become the first Hafiza in her family, and her mother would tell Amina that Khaled's light had not died at all. It had merely passed through 3 generations and was now illuminating a 4th. And so the waitress who had been challenged by a billionaire to recite 10 verses, who had poured out 47 from the reservoir of her heart, and who had faced the full force of both adulation and hatred without losing her quiet center, had come full circle. The promise she made to her grandmother on a dusty night in southern Egypt had been tested in the neon glare of global scrutiny and had held. The Quran, which had been her companion in a cramped Dubai apartment, had become a bridge between the powerful and the powerless, a reminder that the words of God are not the property of the wealthy or the learned alone, but belong to anyone willing to carry them. As for the billionaire who had mocked her, he would later say in a rare interview that the 47 verses Amina recited that night were not a performance, but a diagnosis. They had exposed the poverty beneath his billions and offered him the only cure he had ever truly needed. He died 6 years after becoming a Hafiz, not from cancer or drama, but peacefully in his sleep, a copy of the Quran resting on his chest. At his funeral, Amina recited the very same 47 verses that had started it all, and those who listened understood that they were witnessing a circle that eternity itself had drawn. That circle, drawn by a promise between a grandmother and a child in a dusty Egyptian village, now encompassed a billionaire's transformation, a scholar's rediscovered inspiration, a global reckoning with what it means to be truly wealthy, and a chain of girls in rural villages who would carry the Quran forward long after everyone in this story had returned to the earth. The waitress had not only silenced a room, she had rerouted the course of lives that had no reason to intersect, proving that the deepest revolutions begin not in palaces or parliaments, but in the quiet chambers of a devoted heart. What makes this story linger isn't just the drama of the moment. It's the unsettling question it plants in every listener. What would have happened if Amina had stayed silent? How many of us carry something precious, a skill, a promise, a truth, that we keep hidden because the world has told us we are too small, too poor, too invisible to matter? The billionaire's mockery was ugly, but it was also a twisted kind of gift. It drew out of Amina what she had been cultivating in secret for years, and that unveiling set off an earthquake that is still being felt in classrooms from Sana'a to Khartoum, wherever a young girl opens a mushaf and dares to believe that the words are hers to carry. The Quran, after all, was never sent to decorate shelves. It was sent to be embodied. Khaled knew that. Amina proved it. And Tariq, the man who had everything, discovered that he possessed almost nothing until he allowed those words to unmake him. The note he left that first night, the one with $20,000 and a confession of true wealth, was not the end of his journey. It was the cracked door through which light began to enter. So here is the lingering question: what is your 47 verses? What do you carry that, if released into the world, could shake a room, silence arrogance, and outlast your own lifetime? You may not be called to a stage with cameras and dignitaries. Your audience may be one person, or a dozen, or simply the quiet mirror that reflects your own sincerity. But the promise you made to someone who believed in you, or the promise you have yet to make, is a seed waiting for its moment of soil and rain. If Amina's story has stirred something in you, if it has reminded you that faith is not performance but presence, and that the invisible among us often carry the greatest light, then let this be your invitation. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to remember that their quiet devotion matters. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, faith, and the extraordinary hidden in ordinary lives. And in the comments below, tell us, what promise would you keep, even against the mockery of the world? You can buy many things in this life, but you cannot buy the moment when a single voice, armed with nothing but love and memory, silences $1 billion with the truth that is earned in the hidden hours, in the cramped apartments, in the dusty villages, and in the hearts of those who refuse to let the light go out.